Hi everybody, thank you for coming and welcome to today's webinar, Gaining Buy-in for Database DevOps in a World of Increased Data Governance. My name is Becky and I'm a Product Marketing Manager here at Redgate. We have Simon Sabin, who is the founder of SQL Bits, Microsoft Regional Director and MVP, and Simon will be presenting the webinar today. Just some housekeeping rules, you're all on mute, so if you do have any questions, please add them to the question box on screen and we can answer them as we go, but we'll also be saving some time at the end dedicated to answering those questions. We'll also be sending around a recording of the webinar and all the slides to those attending, should you wish to share these with your colleagues. So I'm going to hand over now to Simon, who'll take things from here.
Thanks very much. So welcome, folks, to a nice balmy Tuesday afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are in the world. So in the next 45 minutes, going to go through some aspects of DevOps and what it means from a governance perspective. I think lots of us have probably been doing automation or doing some level of compliance work for a number of years, and the question is, what is it about now, the situation that we're in from a systems and development perspective, that mean that DevOps is such a big thing and governance is such a big thing? And for me, there's a number of things that are bringing the world together. One is the cloud. Companies are wanting to make best use of the cloud and what it can bring. And what it can bring is that agility and that digital transformation capability to add functionality and add capability to your business without massive amount of overhead in terms of infrastructure and CapEx. And so going along with that is the need to be able to change fast and adapt to the business and the world that we live in. Alongside that, data is the currency of the world. If we look at the largest companies in the world, they are companies that are ones that are growing faster, those that have got access to data and are making the most use of data. And so for me, DevOps really enables us to make the most of that digital transformation, that cloud capability, but fundamentally really helps us do that in a way that helps governance. When we're looking after data, we need to make sure that we do things properly. The whole GDPR thing is fascinating and is imposing a number of challenges on many organizations. But fundamentally, it's all about doing the right thing with data and making sure we are responsible with what we do. And I think that having a DevOps mentality and a DevOps approach to how you manage your systems really, really helps from a governance perspective. So, as I mentioned, I'm Simon Sabin. I own a database consultancy, data platform consultancy that helps companies make the most of data and data platforms and helps them change their data platforms. One of the things that we see a lot is the fact that companies that have got data platforms can't change rapidly because data is data. You can't just go and delete it and recreate it in another place. You have to keep hold of this data and look after it. Unlike the application world, where largely you can create a new version of your application, delete the old one, and just rerun the new one, and job's good. With data, you've got to look after it. And so managing change in this world is really hard. How do you do it online? How do you do that in a continuous process? How do you do that in a fast, continuous process? And also, I think what we see is that the tooling and the capabilities for doing DevOps around data is pretty poor. So our friends at Redgate are doing a world of in terms of providing more and more tooling, but really compared to the rest of the development world, the tooling and the capabilities in the data land is very, very poor. And so we have to come to the table with our own capabilities, and that's what we do as a business. I also run and founded SQLBits. So if you don't know what SQLBits is, it's the largest SQL Server conference, data platform conference outside of North America. And we'll be having one at the start of next year, so keep posted. Been an MVP for 13 years, 14 years, and been a Microsoft Regional Director for 3, which means that we help Microsoft on some of their strategic directions in terms of working with the community. And I am passionate about DevOps. I've been doing automation and deployments for many years, and it's nice to see finally that companies are investing their time and money in making sure that these capabilities come to town. So today we're going to go through a number of areas. What's changed in the world that means that this is really important. Look at the organization and how you have to look at the organization to make your DevOps journey work very well. And look at some of the core things I think DevOps really comes and helps from a governance perspective in terms of decision making, in terms of controls, testing, and then we're going to look at how you can get some buy-in. So not only those values of what DevOps gives, how do you then use those to get buy-in? So let's start off with what's changed. So as I mentioned, data is the lifeblood, and digital transformation is meaning that companies are really wanting to get to make change quickly. But on top of that, I'm really, really pleased the fact that governance is becoming much more of a strong thing. Interestingly, the world hasn't come to an end since GDPR came into being in May, but hopefully some people will get fined, and the journey of making sure that people do look after their data stays at the forefront of many companies. So let's look at this organization that we've got. Now, part of the challenge with any organization, and this doesn't just apply to DevOps, is that you've got the business, you've got a set of developers, but then from a governance perspective, you generally have the legal people that want to make sure that you're doing things right, and security that think that they own the security aspect of making sure that everything is secure. And each of these has got a different direction, a different sort of goal. The business person wants to essentially get market share, they want to get features to market, they want to be that differentiator, they want to transform their business to make sure that it's keeping up, and they want to look after cost. The developer, generally, they just want to get stories done because that's what they're measured on. They're measured on delivering features to make the person that's asking for features to be happy, and in doing that, they don't want to be fired. But they also have this desire, generally, to write good code. They don't really want to be writing bad code, and they want to be writing code using new technologies and new systems. And so there's some things there that you can hook into to help your DevOps journey. The lawyer wants to make sure that everything is being done right. Everything has been done to the letter of the law, and making sure that the right people have got access and you know what's going on. And then finally, you've got the security person. And to some extent, I'd put the DBA in this area as well. Is often the DBA is acting as a bit of a control person. They want to make sure they think that they're the person is ultimately responsible for the data. And so they're the person that's trying to control access. They think they're responsible, and they're trying to reduce risk by avoiding making change because they think making change is quite risky. So each one of these people is got slightly different directions. And so getting those to work together is really quite hard. But fundamentally, that's what you need to do. A, to be successful, but B, to have a successful DevOps journey. So one of the aspects of DevOps is the collaboration aspect. And so that really helps. Now, if you look at the collaboration aspect, if I look at a sort of classic sort of enterprise world, you might have a release process of code which results in a dev doing some changes, but you end up with this DBA person or a blocker person that's basically blocking that path to production. Now, the blockage is there because they think they're adding value and reducing risk. But I actually think that you can implement some good practices from a DevOps perspective that means that you don't need to have those steps in place. And to some extent, if you're doing things like reviews or checks about what a deployment is doing, or actually running a script doesn't really need a human to do that. Also, most reviews of code, if done by a human, aren't that good. Generally, from a reviewing perspective, computers are pretty good at doing reviews. You can put tests in place to make sure that your code is tested to a standard set of tests as opposed to the DBA that's got up in the morning, had a bit of a bad night's sleep, and so is a bit grumpy, and so wants every select to be uppercased, and the next day they don't mind. But removing the human from that process to some extent is a good thing. So really, all the people have to work together. And fundamentally, that's the whole core aspect of DevOps, is that you've got this continuous process, and this continuous process about thinking what is being done, deciding what to do and do it, and then feedback and feed that back into the system to go and say, okay, how did we get on? Should we going to change that? Yes, no, let's do something different. And so it drives a collaborative mentality because everyone is doing things based on the same decision points. So all the information that's coming back from your production system is helping to drive the next set of thought processes. If you don't get agreement on what you're trying to achieve, then there's no way that you're going to be able to achieve it because you're going to have everybody pulling in different directions. So one of the core aspects of DevOps is that collaboration to get that decision point working. Now, from a deployment perspective, generally this is what we have. I'm not sure how many of you have actually got a development deployment DevOps process in place, but throughout this life cycle of getting changes pushed into production, you are doing some activity and then you're verifying it, whether that's all the way on the left over in the develop and verify, or all the way on the right where you've done your deployment and you're still verifying. So on the left-hand side, when you're doing the development, you're potentially doing unit testing. On the far right, when you've released it into production, you're potentially using things like SQL Monitor to monitor your system to see whether your systems are still performing. But people think that the whole sort of purpose of DevOps is about automated change, and it's risky. If we actually look back at this process doesn't necessarily need to be automated. It's just having a consistent process by which you're getting changes through a number of stages that are verifying your code and verifying it in a way that's repeatable and getting it into production and enabling you to verify it, fail fast, and iterate on what you're doing. Now, from a business perspective, if you fail on the right-hand side when you've deployed it into production, that's potentially catastrophic. I'm sure we've all had a situation where we've made a production change and it's gone wrong. Now, we don't want to be in that situation, but those situations can happen if you don't necessarily have enough checks and balances before you get there. I'm sure we've all had situations where we haven't necessarily made a bad change to production, but we're there at 2 in the morning and someone's given us a script to release, and it doesn't run. And it doesn't run because there hasn't been enough verification in the process. And having that consistent, reliable process for getting things into production is one of the fundamentals about DevOps. But it doesn't have to be automated. It's not like I make a single change and bam, it's in production. That's what you hear about with Amazon and Etsy and all the companies that are doing sort of very fast continuous delivery. But that's a long way off. If you're starting your journey, that's a long way off. Getting a consistent, reliable road to production is much more important. So let's address this risk aspect. And fundamentally, compliance and governance is all about managing risk. So why does DevOps help from a risk perspective? Well, we all did science at school, and if we made a change, then if we make a change and something's happened, then we know that that thing that happened was because of that change. If we make a small change, i.e. we change one thing, then the likelihood of figuring out what went on if something went wrong is a lot better. Also, the likelihood of something going wrong, because we can test it better because it's only a small thing, is a lot less. And so doing a small change results in a small amount of risk. Similarly, if we have a frequent process, then there's a familiarity with that process. And because of the familiarity, we're reducing risk. How many times have we gone and tried to, I don't know, log into our tax return system and we can't remember the password because we only do it every year? Now, that's an inconsequential thing. We can go and find it. But if someone forgets the fact that, oh, when we do a release, we need to go and turn off this system over here because it's connecting to a production database, and if it's still pulling data, it's going to have problems. If they only do a release once every 6 months, the likelihood of them remembering is really quite small. And so you end up with a problem where they're not familiar with the system and thus they're introducing risk. Now, I'm sure we've all also had situations where someone has said, right, I'm going to make some change to the system, and then they spent a few months writing some changes, optimizing some store procs or creating some new tables and doing some work to the ETL or something, and they go to make the change and it fails. Now, this comes back to the small change thing again as well, is the fact that because they've done such a big thing, who knows what aspect of that big lump of work actually caused the failure. So moving to a continuous process where you have that small change and everyone's small change continuously being tested together means that you're detecting that a failure occurs fast and you're reducing risk. Any of you that are old enough to remember SQL 2005 will remember the fact that it took 5 years to get out, to be released after SQL 2000. Now, actually, it took 7 years to develop. Now, the reason it took 7 years to develop was because historically, back in the day, the SQL Server team were working on big features. It's like, we're going to do this feature and this feature. And when they'd get that feature sort of in a state that they thought was good, they would then try and merge it into their master code branch. It would take them weeks, months to merge it into their master code branch and get it all tested. So imagine doing that 6 or 7 times. It basically took them those extra 3 or 4 years to actually get back to a stable code base that had all the features that they thought they really wanted in. If you look at the SQL Server team now, they have a single branch of code for the whole of SQL Server and SQL Azure. They do small changes, they continually release it, and they're able to turn features on and off to enable them to release that code and test it very quickly and continuously. Now, once we've got things continuously working, we really need an automation process. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean automatic. as in I check it in and it's all the way to production. But there's a number of steps that need to go through in terms of building, testing, deploying. And once you've got those working reliably, then you can start automating. And once you've got reliability, you're then reducing risk. If you haven't got something that's reliable, then no one trusts it. You don't want to get into that car that is unreliable, do you? Because you don't know whether you're going to get to the end. Your business isn't going to trust you to release code if they don't think that you've got a reliable process. And so before you can get to that automated holy grail of continuous delivery, you need to get reliability. But once you've got it, you're reducing risk because you've got automation, and therefore you've got people that aren't sticking their fingers in the pie and affecting that release process. And then monitoring. Monitoring, I really should have put first. Monitoring, I think, is the most important thing. DevOps has got this continuous loop. You are monitoring what is going on and then deciding what to do based on that monitoring. Whether that's monitoring production, your development machine, I'm sure you've all used Management Studio and you've written some code and you've got a red squiggly. Now you've been monitoring or Management Studio has been monitoring the code you're writing and has instantly told you that you have written some bad code and given you an error. Now, having that monitoring in place enables you to detect failure, and once you can detect failure, then you can fix things. I'm sure we've all had situations where someone has deployed something to production and no one's noticed the fact that something changed and something was broken for a while. We had a client the other day that didn't notice the fact that one of their VMs in AWS for some reason hadn't rebooted after a patch, and because they didn't have the monitoring to detect that it was up, it just went undetected for a long time. So when you've got that monitoring in place, then and you've got that philosophy, you're going to reduce risk because you're going to find things quickly. It might be that you still have issues, but you're going to find them quickly and fix them quickly. For me, monitoring is the most important thing to get to a DevOps mentality. Finally, automation. I say finally because I think on your journey, automation isn't necessarily the first thing you need to look at. People often think, oh yeah, I want to automate everything. That's great, but that's really expensive to get there. It's really hard. It's like saying, right, I'm going to build a car. Haven't built a car before, but I'm going to build a car. Maybe you should build a go-kart first, or something a bit simpler than a car, because cars are complicated. And the same for a DevOps process. It can be complicated. And so if you try and do everything and automate everything, it can be hard, especially if you've still got on-premise stuff. The cloud is been designed for automation. On-premise stuff, not so much. But once you've got automation, then that will give you a consistent approach, which will reduce your risk as well. So fundamentally, DevOps gives you that reduced risk. Now, there's some excuse me. So on the contrary, if you have an unreliable process and you have automation and it's continuous, then it's like having a conveyor belt that's just piling stuff and it's just falling off the end and it's just crashing. That's effectively what you're going to end up with. If you've got manual effort, it does prevent continuousness and consistency. By manual effort, I mean manual actions like reviewing code that are innately complicated. Those things are pretty bad. And if you don't have the feedback, you don't know. It's like driving a car and not knowing when you've crashed. So you innately have feedback because you have your own sensors of detecting what's going on. If you didn't, you could quite easily drive your car off a cliff and not realize it because you haven't been monitoring the road. So DevOps is this continuous process where you have to iterate around and have that feedback loop. The other areas of compliance and governance has got massive synergies with a DevOps mentality. So you want to have collaboration because from a collaboration perspective, then it means you know what you're doing from a compliance perspective. Maintenance, you need to maintain your systems. If you're not maintaining your systems, if you're not servicing your car, that's considered really bad from a compliance perspective. If you've got a mechanism for continually testing and making changes to your system, that maintenance is just easy. You need to make your data and systems accurate. DevOps has got a testing mentality, so you can test it. You can run monitoring on your production system. You need to be thoughtful about your decision making, and you want to have that decision making process tracked and traced, and DevOps gives you that capability. And then control and security. So that control, you need to be able to say, okay, only Fred blogs can make these changes. Well, having a system of source control and builds and releases, all the platforms have got built in those controls so that there are permissions about who can do what, who can make a deployment to production. So there's a massive synergy between these two. And that's why I think compliance and DevOps really work well together. Imagine if you don't do DevOps. You've got to build all of those things on the DevOps thing yourself, or put together a number of systems to do that, and it becomes a lot harder. So when we look at this organization, again, we've got these business users that have got different needs and different directions. So how do we get buy-in, and how do we get the understanding of what we're doing, but also gain agreement? So with development, one of the big challenges is access to production and test data. Having developers think in isolation and go, yeah, we need to have production data. We need to have production data to do testing. I need to be able to access production to go and figure out what's gone on in the system. So there's lots of areas of development that need some work and need people to work together. So in getting buy-in to get your DevOps process working, if you've just got a developer doing it, then the problem is having a developer just doing it, they won't have the time to do it because, as we said in the organizational picture, the developer is driven by the stories he's given. Largely, unless you've got some superstar developers, they're not going to do things that aren't on their backlog. And so the business top down needs to give the developers time to be able to implement some DevOps capability. Now, they're not, if we looked at the business owner, the guy on the board, one of the big things they're worried about is cost. And the biggest issue that we see in many situations that people doing DevOps is that they don't really understand how much it's going to cost because they haven't done it before. And so it's a really potential black hole bucket of cash that they're going to have to spend on this process. So the board need to get some buy-in, but largely they're not going to invest in £250,000 in building a DevOps process. That doesn't really happen because they can't hang some business market value off that capability. So you need to start small. Similarly, the legal team need to have buy-in. They want to make sure that you're doing things right. If you don't, they're going to start being draconian and saying you can't do things. Now, the organizational picture I showed, let's go back. What I generally find is the two people, top and bottom, want to move as fast as possible and get stuff done, and the people on the left and right are the ones that are putting the brakes on. So you need to make the business owner guy give the time and the money and the space for the teams, the developer teams, to do their thing, but you need to get the legal team and the security guys and the DBAs on board, get them comfortable of what's being done from a governance perspective and compliance perspective to make sure they don't put those blockers in place. So similarly, we talked about top down, bottom up works as well. The two need to work together. The development teams need to want to do this. And in doing that, one of the great things is if you do a definition of done, if you're doing agile, then in that definition of done, make sure that there are some metrics of achieving some DevOps capabilities. If the metrics are in there and it's in their definition of done, then they should be moving towards doing that. Now, the other aspect is feed their hunger for doing things from a coding perspective, using cool code. You can do some amazing things from a testing and automation perspective. Feed that hunger and get them to do that. So that's getting the organizational view. So you've got to get these people working together, and there are some levers that you can pull on each one of those people to work together. Now, from a legal and a security perspective, showing how DevOps can work well is what we're going to talk about now. So the whole auditability, what were you thinking when you made a decision? So in the GDPR requirement, you need to have that thoughtful decision about someone made this decision, and you can trace it back to a business decision that you decided to go and make this change. So why did you delete some data? Any decision that you've made in the system. Now, how do you prove that? Well, let's have a look. One of the nice things in a DevOps world is the fact that you have a set of traceabilities. So I've got an access control. This is a build of some code that's doing access control back to a system. Now this has actually failed, and it's failed because if I go and look at my tests, my test is showing that ensure the correct logins are in place. So there is a login that is missing. So there are two logins that are missing, and there's a Paul Smith login that is the expected user is Paul Smith, and it doesn't exist. So if we go and look back, we can trace this back to a commit. So who made changes to the code? So in our commit, oh, looks like it was me that made the change. I went and added Paul Smith. Like, well, okay, was that someone doing it malicious? So you can see I'm the person up here that's made the change. So did I do this maliciously? Well, actually, there is a work item associated with this, which tells me that actually this was a business decision to go and add this user, and Paul Smith needs to be added to the system. And if I wanted to, then if I was having a richer system, there would be discussion that would have agreement about who did it, and maybe some notes with some approvals to show that this is what we've agreed should be done. So there's a number of checks and balances in there to make sure that there's an audit trail of features coming all the way back. You can go even further. You can have pull requests, and you can have policies, and you can put lots of controls and governance in place to make sure that changes don't get released, don't get into the system that aren't allowed. If you've got a bunch of scripts sitting on a network share, show me the change control on those bunch of scripts that shows that no one has changed them between when I went and copied the file in and when the DBA decided to go and run them 12 hours later. Very, very difficult. In this situation, there's no humans involved. Once I've checked that code in, the system is automatically pulling it from source control and applying the changes that I've applied, that I've checked in to the system and testing those. So the DevOps mentality of using work items, whether it's VSTS, TFS, Jira, has this capability of doing collaboration so you can see the traceability of who's doing what. Discussions and implementation information is tracked. There's acceptance criteria is agreed, and tests can be implemented to meet those criteria. And then you've got that traceability back to requirements. Massive capability from an audit and perspective. Whether it's PCI, GDPR, anywhere that's doing some good governance, it's something you should be conscious of. So another area is controls. One of the concerns about DevOps is the fact that people will be making changes that they shouldn't do and getting things into production. Well, really, you want to have dual responsibility. You don't want to have someone checking in some code and in your really sensitive system, that going straight through to production. Lots of people are uneasy about that. Now, almost every system has got an element of control that enables that to be managed, whether it's pull requests or whether it's build triggers, whether it's release triggers. And so we can quickly show you another example where we have got some releases of some code in our sample, and this is a pre-prod environment. We've got 100% test coverage, so all our tests have passed. So if we go and unfilter all our changes, we can see that all our tests are passed, which is good. And so, but it hasn't gone to production. And it hasn't gone to production because there's a pre-deployment approval that is required. So this is actually timed out. I set it off too long ago, but essentially the approval waited for me to go and do to manually approve it, and we've set this up to be 30-minute timeout. But I could have manually gone in and gone and approved this if I had done it within the time. So I've got complete control while someone has checked some code in, it's built, it's been released to pre-prod, it's not gone to prod until we're happy with it and someone has manually approved it. And that might be because you don't want to do a release at 8 o'clock on your sales day when you're expecting £10 billion of sales at 9 o'clock. Probably not advised. So you have a number of ways of controlling things in a DevOps process. You've got pull requests and policies. You've got peer reviewing. You've got build gates and validation. And then you've also got testing. So testing is the basic form of control. And the last gate on the door is the approval of releases. So manually approving those releases into production. Now, I agree, I approve of manual approvals. What I don't agree with is having someone approve it that has to go and review a whole load of code before they approve it. I don't think humans can review code very well. And so any system you do should go and tell the person what they need to know by the virtue of a number of tests passing and based on that, they can decide whether to go into production or not. So security and DevOps. We want to maintain our security controls, and it's an area that we see a lot where people don't do security and DevOps. They manage their security in a different way. Now, I think that's a pretty bad thing to do, because what ends up happening is that you don't have all those great things about control and pull requests and reviews and traceability back to work items all in one place. If you do have your security in your source control, it gives you all of those capabilities. So let's show another quick demo. So in this situation, what we have is we have users and logins defined as tests to say who should access, and then we have our database project which defines those logins and users. Now, you might ask, well, why have I got it in two places? Well, for me, you want it in two places because you want those checks and balances. It might be easy for someone to accidentally add a user in the wrong place in one place. Now, if they forget to add it in, if they only add it in one place, then it's probably an accident. If they deliberately add it in two places, then that's intentional, and therefore, if it's not agreed, it's malicious. And so you can very much track who's doing what, and it gives you those checks and balances. You could also, if you wanted, have these tests defined in a separate place in your source control and only have certain people allowed to control that. And therefore, there's a duality of control where the checks and the balances are done by two different people. What we also have is we have a set of tests within our system which are going off and are validating all the permissions. So even before I've deployed this into production, I've got a test here which says ensure system sysadmin doesn't have access to data. So we've implemented a test which we have implemented a set of security permissions, which means that sysadmin doesn't even have access to the data. You've got to grant people access to the data explicitly. And we're doing that through row-level security and a number of the other features in SQL Server. And what should happen is, sysadmin does not have access to the data. And the expected should be 4, and the actual is 0. The expected should be 0, and the actual is 4. So they are seeing the rows. So there's something wrong in my change that I made, which means that the sysadmin, based on the change I've made, will have access to the system, and that's not a good thing. So this means that we're validating this way up front before we even get into production. So if you're happy with the fact that this test is there and in place as a security person, then you'll be happy in making releases through this process in doing those checks and balances through your deployment process. And finally, accuracy. You need to make sure your systems are accurate. And so running tests is fundamentally what accuracy is all about. You need to verify that your changes should be doing what they should be doing. You make sure that if you've got a fix, you write a test to test your fix, and if your test passes, then your fix should pass and it should be fine to release it. If you have that mentality, then you should be more comfortable in getting things into production. It's an area where testing and data is harder, but it's definitely something that's doable. If you know a bit of code, so add preferences C# or Pester, and using those things, you can go and write tests very easily. So it can test everything from permissions to data quality and to masking. And we just showed you those examples in that Visual Studio project, which tested the fact that the permissions were being set correctly. I'd made a change, I'd broken that test, and therefore that wouldn't be able to be released until I'd fixed it. So getting buy-in. Getting buy-in is essential. Now, the biggest thing for me is to get buy-in. Hopefully those features that we've just showed you, get some buy-in, get people a flavor of what is possible. Now, what you therefore need to do is, once you've got that taste that people are interested, is start showing success. Show a little thing. And so what you need to do is you need to define what you're going to measure. What is success? So where are you now? You have a totally manual process and you want to automate it. What do you want to improve? Reliability. Do you want to make sure it's compliant so that you have less people with access to production? You want less deployment failures. You want to improve your time to release. Look at those things, take one of them and focus on that thing. It's very important to focus on one thing and a little thing to show success. Once you've shown success, then it's a bit of a continuous cycle. People will see the success and keep going. The worst we see is where people don't do that and they end up in a situation where they spend 3 months, 4 people on a team, and the CEO comes over and goes, well, what have we achieved? And you go, well, I've got this amazing script that deploys a VM and there's no value. If you get everybody agreeing what the metric is and you achieve that, that's fundamentally what it's all about. That's a DevOps mentality. So apply a DevOps mentality to implementing your DevOps process. Measures are crucial. So if you're in a governance perspective, maybe you look at classification, data classification, the quantity of data catalog, whether you've got descriptions and owners, maybe it's checking quality, maybe it's whether you've got that traceability back to work items. Come up with what you want to do. It's not about everything. You can't do everything. You have to start small. So start small. Implementing a DevOps process is a very long road. Very long road. It's actually more like a big chasm and you need to build a bridge, because you need to get your code into production and you need to get that bridge built to get your code into production. Even if it's some manual steps to start with, that's what you really need to do first. Now, it doesn't need to be massive force bridge. It could just be a little rope bridge. We've got some demos on GitHub which just talk about deploying a bunch of scripts. You don't necessarily need SSDT or Redgate CI or any other tools. They do help. Once you've started getting there, focus on what you want to achieve, and once you've achieved that, then you can look at optimizing and building your system even further. So fundamentally, what does DevOps give you? It gives you a traceable system. It's a mentality of testing and validating changes. You have few humans, and thus it's more reliable and less risky. Automation continuous capabilities mean that you're reducing access to sensitive data and production data. So from a compliance perspective, it's just a win-win-win. The monitoring and feedback loop means you know what's going on, and so that's also reducing risk. Altogether, it's just reducing risk, and thus is a really good thing from a compliance perspective. So, how to succeed? Get buy-in and traction, even if it's for a little thing. But do DevOps to do your DevOps. Start small, define some metrics that you want to achieve, a small metric that you want to improve. Get that included in the definition of done so people are doing it all the time. Get those teams measured by those metrics, and then they will foster the mentality to improve those metrics and get those done. Build the tooling and develop what's needed. And importantly, track and praise progress. If you're a manager that's trying to do this stuff, tracking and praising the progress and the fact that you've achieved your goal, people don't shout about this enough. It's very techie. So you invariably have the techie team in the corner getting stuff done. I always see you end up with teams that spend probably a year, 2 years getting to the point where everything's really, really good. And then they start shouting about the fact they've done so many hundreds of releases a month. Start praising before that you've removed manual processes, that you've automated a load of testing. Start shouting about that and be proud of it, and making sure that you're getting stuff done. So that's it. Simple. Start small, move forward, and get there. Any questions?
Thanks for that, Simon. I think we're all out of time, unfortunately. So if that's all right with everyone who asks questions, we'll get back to you directly. But of course, we'll send that round with the webinar recording and the slides as well.
Yeah, if you've got questions, then feel free to ping me, and I'm happy to answer them, or one of my team can answer them. But yeah, good luck with your journey, and yeah, enjoy.
Thank you, Simon.